say that the more that we have folks having these type of conversations, and the more we have people like Dr. Tiff sharing their story, it really kind of gives other people the courage that they need to say, you know what, me too. I have some things that I'm dealing with, and I'm not dealing with them too well. I want to access some professional services.
So, Dr. Tucker, what are the most common mental health issues that you see in Black and Brown communities? Like, is it bipolar? Is it depression? What are the most common forms or types?
Well, the term mental health really is expanding, right? So I entered the field over 20 years ago. And I'll be very honest with you, I think even what social work and what therapy looks like today in 2022 is very different from what it looked like when I entered the field back in 1999. It was much more community-based. We were traveling to people's homes. I started in South Louisiana in some of the most disenfranchised, impoverished communities outside of Baton Rouge, New Orleans, a town called, shout out to Ponchatoula, names that none of you guys would even recognize at all. And at that particular time, it was really kind of focused on not just providing the family therapy and the individual counseling, but providing case management, right? So that was one form of mental health services, which really is a fancy term for how do we get people the most basic needs that they need, such as food, housing, transportation, electricity, warmth, or perhaps even cooling in the hot heat of the summer Louisiana. So there are various forms of mental health services, right? So we have individual counseling for folks who want to kind of focus on the individual needs. There's family counseling, there's couples counseling. There are all different types of counseling modalities. And then you kind of get into the evidence-based treatment, such as cognitive behavioral, emotion-focused therapy, trauma-focused therapy. And then you have dialectical behavioral therapy. There are myriad forms of different types of counseling, but I would say fundamentally, they're all focused on how do I become the better version of myself by addressing the most pressing and perhaps most oppressive traumas that a person might have been through in their particular life.
Wow, that is so great. And it's so deep, Dr. Tucker, when you talk about access to care, right? I think that history that you gave is so important because one of the things that resonated with me is like, this is something that was designed not with us in mind. And so many things were not designed with us in mind. I do recognize a lot of those names because I actually graduated from Xavier University in New Orleans. So those names are very much relative to me. And I remember being in a completely different culture down there in New Orleans. And some of it was almost like being in a third world country, really. And when I look at in comparison to North Carolina and being in like backwoods Louisiana. So is access the main roadblock, or what other roadblocks exist in terms of, what that prevent delay in treatment for people of color?
Well, I think when we talk about access, there are some other factors that we have to keep in mind as it relates to having a conversation around mental health and the utilization of mental health services, even when it is accessible. And so you talked about some of the conditions of Louisiana, and you're right. I think it extends across this country. I think there are certain areas where it may be more dire than others. But let's just kind of take a step back for a second, right? So before we get to access, I think it's important to talk about the importance of privilege, the privilege of having mental health services. You think about Maslow, we're all, healthcare providers. Where does the privilege to even think about your mental health, how does it relate to those basic needs? And so you think about this whole Maslow period of hierarchy of needs. Before I can talk about my depression and my anxiety, before I can talk about my trauma, do I have housing, right? Do I have the privilege to even have healthy relationships in my life that I feel comfortable enough to begin to explore these more higher levels of needs, such as addressing my own mental health, right? For so many people, we really haven't had the privilege to focus on depression, to focus on anxiety, because you live in these high crime communities. You live in these areas where you're dealing with so many other social, political, environmental stressors that to even address your depression and anxiety is kind of really on the back burner. So that's a really important discussion to have as well, is that I would say one of the biggest barriers to mental health services is not even access. It's the privilege to not being able to even address your behavioral health issues because you're dealing with what we call, real life problems.
Right.
Does it make sense?
It
Yeah.
does. I think that it's very important that what you're saying, pretty much you're saying that you're struggling. There are people that are struggling to meet their basic needs, which to somebody else might not look to be that serious, but that you're not on that level where you're able to, provide efficiently with basic needs such as food and education for your family or your kids, or education for yourself. For us all sitting here on a camera and being here on the Zoom, and I'm speaking for myself, being somebody of color is almost a privilege. You almost feel like it's a privilege within itself. Am I wrong to say that? So yeah, I definitely, I like where you're going with that, as far as that's definitely a barrier. It's definitely a barrier.
I think about the community that I was born and raised in. And again, I don't want to monopolize the time, but first of all, this is my breakout show. So I really appreciate you guys for giving me the platform to discuss these issues. But I think about the community in which I was born and raised. There were so many, again, environmental stressors. You talk about poverty. You talk about gangs that are, just kind of affecting the day-to-day culture of a particular community. There's homelessness. There's, again, I cannot overstate the impact of poverty. I don't think we look at poverty as a type of trauma, but being poor is traumatizing, right? Being hungry is traumatizing. But I think at the same time, we shouldn't feel guilty for having a privilege to
Right.
focus on mental health.
Right.
I think it's a sign of the progress that we are enjoying. Again, I think about where we are in 2022 versus 20 years ago. Even though we have a long way to go in terms of kind of breaking down the stigma of mental health services and therapy in the Black community, we have gone a tremendous amount. It has just moved so far ahead. And I would say that the more that we have folks having these type of conversations, and the more we have people like Dr. Tiff sharing their story, it really kind of gives other people the courage that they need to say, you know what, me too. I have some things that I'm dealing with, and I'm not dealing with them too well. I want to access some professional services.